We are back. It's time to hook back into my 1982 Hilux restoration projects. Now, last episode, we stripped the cab, we stripped the chassis, stripped the interior, and got it all ready. And then we started doing a bunch of panel preparation with paint stripping and acid washing on some of the doors and guards ready for the primer, which is what they're in now. We also took the cab and chassis down to sandblasting. This episode, we're going to be showing you how to do some panel repair and rust repair on these panels so you can have a go on your project yourself at home. A bunch of you on the last episode on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube, of course, asked some fantastic questions that you wanted to know about the process. So we're going to be answering those questions throughout this episode. And if you've got any more that you're not sure about, chuck them in the comments and we'll be sure to get to them for next time. First things first, come with me. So as you can see, the cab is in primer. So this is the exact same primer that we put on the guards in the last episode. It was done by the sandblaster. So they stripped it all back, then they put it in that epoxy primer, and then we picked it up and brought it back here. Now, you can see here we've got a guard on the side, we've got the doors and bonnet over there. So as you can see, there's plenty to do. I am super excited and I hope you are too. This is going to be awesome. Let's hook in. A couple of days earlier, Damien prepped the tub and got it ready for sandblasting. Right, what do we got?
Well, because I've only got you for a couple of days, we got locks is what we got. We're going to get that chassis done, otherwise we're going to be in big trouble. And then we had a little bit of feedback about the diffs. So I've got one of those over there for you to unmask.
Okay.
So they've come up really good actually, they'll be good. And then we're going to, we've got the front guard there that you started last time you were here. You got it all prepped and primed and ready for filler and panel work. You've got some rust to repair, got some bits and pieces there. Got to get that bonnet done. We've got a dent in the bonnet and a few other bits I want to get done on that so we can get that into polyester. We've got to get the chassis painted. We've got the front guard that we're going to do the polyester on. We're going to prime that. Then she's ready for paint.
A bit on. There's plenty to do. Well, all right,
I'm exhausted already.
Yeah. I think there's only one thing for that. Let's hook in.
Yeah, come on, let's do it.
They're back.
They're back, mate.
They're back.
It's my super suit.
Yeah.
Come on. I don't feel right unless I'm wearing it. Now, I'm going to bring overalls back, people. Everyone should wear them.
First things first, I'm going to be doing some repair work to the chassis. Now you might be wondering, why wasn't this repair work done before it was sandblasted? Well, the advantage of doing it this way is getting the chassis sandblasted means you get rid of all the old surface rust and all the crud and bits and pieces that you wouldn't have been able to, or you would have spent a lot of time sanding it off if you did it by hand. Then once it's in primer, you've got a good platform to then go through and repair any bits you need to. Now that we know that it's been treated and primed, any little bits that we grind back, like I'm about to do here, and then prime over the top, we're only just doing that one little section. The other advantage is it also, because it strips everything back, you can really see any areas on the chassis that you otherwise might have missed if you hadn't done it this way. So for example, it's a little bit pitted here, we can strip that back and make it nice again. There's even a little crack here that we're going to weld up. Doing it this way means you just have a nice base to work off, everything's clean, and you can do the repairs and prime it once you're finished. Grinding back the primer exposes the bare steel beneath, allowing me to weld up those cracks and clean up the look of this chassis. Next up, it's time to wrap to coat the chassis, and I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I reckon it's going to come up absolutely beautiful. The plan is we're going to throw some Raptor on using a very nozzle gun, but I'm going to dial the gun in so it's almost like a smooth matte finish, and then once it's cured, I'm going to go over it with some 2-pack gloss black, so it'll get the strength of the Raptor coating, but it'll look nice and shiny. I reckon it's going to come up really well. But the other advantage is because the chassis is sitting on stands, I'm going to do the underside, get a real nice coating on it, and then once that cures, flip the chassis over and do the top side. So now I'm just going to mix up the Raptor with some hardener and get it on the chassis. Should look good. As always, I'm mixing the Raptor with the hardener with a 3:1 ratio. A smart thing to remember is always clean your gear after each use. This especially rings true with the spray guns, as you don't want to be working with clogged equipment. Another handy tip is to get yourself a couple of cheap brushes from your local hardware store and use them with some thinners to clean your equipment. The reason we decided to Raptor-coat the chassis is it's 40 years old and it's one of the few components that's always exposed to the harsh elements like rocks and salt water or just driving around town. So by Raptor-coating it, we can ensure that it's really going to last, and I reckon it looks really tough.
So we had a bit of feedback from episode 2, and I just want to talk about some of that because there's some really interesting questions. And one of them was, why did we use paint stripper and not sandblast the whole body? And basically, we chose paint stripper because we really didn't want to make more work for ourselves. And what I mean is, by using paint stripper, it's about $40, $50 for a 5 litre can of paint stripper. And you know, if you use the process that we showed, very simple to use, cleans the paint off beautifully. We do no damage to the panels, and that's where I say, how much more work do we want to make for ourselves? If we were to sandblast, is that generates heat and force, and we wind up doing some damage to the panels, which means that, you know, we've got to go through and do some repairs, use some body filler or file up some dents, all of that sort of thing. So the time and the money that we might have saved, or mainly the time, in using paint stripper, we would have certainly spent doing the repairs after sandblasting.
Okay, now it's time to hook into the panel repair and rust repair. Along the way, we're going to be answering some of your questions like I mentioned at the start. Now, what are we looking at? First off, this process that I'm about to show you will remain the same across everything else. Just like we did in the last episode with stripping back to bare steel and sealing it in primer, I'm going to be repeating this process on the other guard, the bonnet, the doors, bits of the cab, you name it. Everything here remains the same. Let me take you through what's going to happen. So step 1, we've got the guard over here. Now, the first step is we're going to be doing any rust repair. And remember, in the last episode, we stripped it back to bare steel. Any rust that was under the paint, we treated it with Brunox and then we sealed it with a primer. So I'm not talking about that rust repair. I'm talking about bits like this where the rust is eaten away at the steel. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. Once that's done, then we're going to give it a light sand. That'll just give us a nice working surface to then come through and do our panel beating. Once we've done the panel beating, we're then going to hit it with some guide coat. Now, this is supposed to be sanded off, but then it's time to hit it with some trusty body filler. Now, to do that, I've got the body filler, of course, we've got the hardener, we've got, this is called an onion board. It's basically just lots of sheets of paper. You mix it up on here. When you're done, you throw it away. They're great. And then some applicator cards to mix it all together. We'll show you how to mix it and the right ratios when the time comes. Once the body filler is on, you guessed it, we can start sanding the panel again. Now, that's where you can use this guide coat, and it'll really just help you make sure the surface is nice and level. Once that's done, the bulk of the body filler is on, it's time to hit it with some spray-on polyester. Now, this is essentially a spray-on version of body filler. Now, this is something that a lot of people might not do in their restoration process. It's done in a lot of professional restoration workshops, and sometimes it can be missed in your DIY jobs. What it will allow is for a nice, even coating of body filler on the guard. There'll be a lot of imperfections that you may not be able to see that this will cover off. So it'll just make a nice, flat, even surface. A fine example of if this may not be done is if you look at a restored vehicle and you stick your eye down the side of it and it may look a little bit wavy, could be a sign that they may not have used this step. Not everyone does it, but it's a little bit of an industry secret I've learned from my mate Damo to make sure you put it on. Once that is all done and your guard's looking nice and level and even, you guessed it, it's time to sand it again. But because you've hit it with this now, you can actually go over it with a much finer abrasive sanding pad, and it'll just give you a much nicer, smoother finish. Once you've done that, we're also going to be hitting the back side of the guard with some Brunox, so it's ready. And then once all that is done and you've gotten a bit over sanding, it's finally time to hit it once again with some epoxy primer, and that means that panel is ready for paint. And along the way, we're going to be explaining why we do each step in a bit more detail, and we'll be answering some of the questions you left us on the last episode. Now that we've cleaned everything up, we've decided it's actually probably going to be better to cut this section out and stitch in a new piece. Still going to weld it in with the oxy, but the problem is if you're just welding up all these little holes, and these are the ones we can see, there might even be some smaller ones around the area, so we're just going to cut this whole section out, make up a new piece, and glue it back in. As we went ahead removing the material that had rust and pinholes, we only cut out what was affected, to then be replaced with steel of the same thickness. From there, it was a matter of giving the steel some treatment with a flat-faced hammer to shape it the way we needed it. There's no need to replace large sections of the panels if they don't need it. After all, I'm trying to keep as much of the original material as possible, and the fact that these panels are very hard to come by in excellent condition, and at times way too expensive for what they are, this is the best way to go about it. Next up, it's time to get the diffs ready for paint. Now, this would be a good time to answer a comment from the last video from 6226 Super Hurricane, and he said, quite rightly, that sandblasting the diff housings can be a risk because you can get sandblasting grit in there and it can be hard to get it out and it can damage your internals when you put it all back together. Now, that can be the case, but in our instance, we made sure that the diff housing was masked really well. The sandblasters, obviously it's not their first rodeo, they masked it up. And we also put some rags and stuff inside. But what is more important is how you take the masking off. You'll notice I've got the housing sitting, facing down towards the ground, and I'm gonna be taking the masking off from down here. The reason for that is, if you have it round this way and you take the masking off, you might have a few little bits of sandblasting grit that could make their way in when you take it off. And you notice even the threads for the studs for the diff center are also masked up, and we shouldn't have any dramas. But it is important to just take your time when you're taking the masking off, and you may need to give it a clean when you're done. Damien's also gone ahead and started cleaning up the diffs to be remasked and prepped, ready for Raptor.
So another little tip when you're masking up is just to make sure that the surface you're going to mask onto is really clean. I always use a bit of cleaner, either wax and grease remover or a bit of a water-based cleaner, just to make sure that you get all that grease and oil off. The other thing too is that people may not be aware that there are automotive high temperature masking tapes. And those tapes are designed to stick really well. They've got some very good adhesive in them. They can also handle heat, and also they can stay on the job for a long time, whereas some of the tapes that you get are more of a house masking tape, so they're not really suitable for automotive. But yeah, hopefully that helps you out.
Of course, with any paint prep, we're also sanding the diffs to help the paint stick. We're using an orbital sander, but you can easily hand sand if that's all you have. And of course, we'll Raptor the diffs and brake components too, to keep everything looking nice.
So Jock's given me a little job here. Basically, he wants to just keep the original mirror, and of course on this door they had the bigger mirror that needed to be bolted in the middle of the door, which means I've got a little bit of work to do to repair these two holes in the middle of the door. So I'll just quickly explain the process that we're going to use here to weld up these holes. All the tools are pretty basic rudimentary tools, but let's have a quick look. So what I'm going to do is firstly just sand off the primer over the top of those holes, so we've got good clean steel for when we weld. I've got a little 0.8mm mild steel welding rod, and that's going to help me fill that hole. Then when we start to weld and introduce heat into the panel, it's going to either swell up or it's going to sink down, one or the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to shrink the panel to get the steel back to its good straight form. And the way we do that is we use a wet rag, a dolly, and I like to use a wooden mallet. And what that does is that won't bruise the metal when we hit it down, to try and shrink the steel back to where it needs to be. So let's have a go. Success! All right. Have a look at this. We've got to be careful. We want to keep this between the two of us because we don't want to give someone by the name of Jocko too big a head. But I'll tell you what, for a bloke who's done his first time of oxy welding, this is very good. Beautiful job. Thanks, Jock. Made my life easy.
Thanks, Damo. But I might leave the rest of the cab repairs to you whilst I crack on with the chassis. All right, the body is making some good progress, so next up, it's time to start hooking into the chassis. I've got a brand new Tough Dog 2-inch suspension lift to put in. It's the exact same suspension that I've got in the Pony, because the chassis is pretty much identical, so it'll fit in nice and easy, and I've got plenty of room to work. The way I'm gonna do it is I'm gonna bolt the leaf springs to the chassis, front and rear, and then I'll sit the diffs underneath, bolt them to the springs, and then I can build the diff housings, get it back on wheels, and then we can roll the chassis around. But first, I need to remove the old bushings and additional bolts from the chassis. I kept these in during the sandblasting and raptoring stage to help keep the threads clean and keep any grit from getting into areas that should be kept nice. It's important to note, and I have mentioned this when I was installing the suspension on my N70 Hilux, but I want to go over it again because it's quite important about how you grease bushes before you install them. So I've got a little bit of grease here, and when you're putting grease on your bush, don't put it on this outer face here. You want it on this outside section of the bush here, and you also want it inside where the pin goes. You want to use a silicon or lithium-based grease, and the reason you don't want to put it here is because when you put the bush in, what's going to happen is, imagine my finger is the pin for the spring. As you flex, it's going to turn. So you want that to be the section that turns. You don't want the bush to turn. And if you have grease on this section, what will happen is when you flex up, it's gonna pull on this bush a bit. And if you've got grease on there, little bits of dirt and bits and pieces will work their way in. And as the bush is working and doing its job, it's actually almost gonna create like a corrosive paste, which will wear down the outside of your bush. In some cases, it can even cause witness marks, even on the inside of where the bush sits as well. So very important, just get a nice coating of grease inside, and then on that outer face, because that's where the shackle plate sits, and chuck him in. The good thing about Toyotas is the design didn't change that much, and the suspension I'm installing in this vehicle is really similar to the Pony, with some slightly different spring rates in the rear. That's because this vehicle isn't going to be carrying as much of a load as the Pony is. It's going to be an open tub with the occasional bit of camping gear in there. So I've gone for a bit more of a comfort orientated spring, but the process remains the exact same. It's a leaf sprung Hilux, so it's getting nice new Tough Dog springs and shocks all round, and I reckon it's going to drive beautifully, when, you know, it is actually driving. Just as I finished cleaning up the insides of the diff housings, the reconditioned diff centers arrived, ready to be installed into the diffs. A good thing about this kit, this is a whole swivel hub rebuild kit from DriveTech, and all those parts down there, the rotors, the pads, the studs, any other bits and pieces, even right down to new bearing nuts and lock washers and stuff, I actually got all of it off 4drive247.com, which made it super easy. I got it shipped here to Damo's place, so I rocked up, it was all here ready to go, and it means that I know I'm putting nice, new, good quality stuff in the vehicle, and it'll be good for years to come. It really helps to lay everything out that you're installing so you know everything's there, ready to go. This is where the Ziploc bags come in handy. Since I labelled everything from the start, it's as easy as finding the labelled bag for the right bolts and nuts. The body's all done, it went back together super easy. Now I haven't tightened up the suspension fully yet. I'm gonna do that once it's got a bit more weight in it, just so the bushes and stuff settle. You don't wanna tighten things up when it's in the air. You can cause a bit more stress on the bush when you put it back down on the ground in your suspension. For now, that's all pretty much done on the chassis, and it's time to get back onto the bodywork. We're getting there, bit by bit, the vehicle's coming together. All right, we've just hooked up the trailer and now we're heading into town to Wingfield, back to Blasting Painting Services, which is where we got the cab and chassis sandblasted and primed, to go and pick up the tub. Whilst Damo's working away inside, I thought I'd get started on some panel beating on the tub. We also had a bunch of questions on what tools you need to give panel beating a go yourself. Well, I'll show you this kit. I got this from a local auto parts store. It's only like $200 and it comes with pretty much everything you need to get started at home. A couple of different flat face hammers and a range of different dollies. That is almost everything you'll need, plus a few basic tools you'll probably find in your shed. I got some multi-grips, a flat blade screwdriver, and of course, the trusty crowbar. Now, this did a lot of work on the pony when we repaired the tub in particular on that, but this can just help to get into real tight spots where you can get a bit of leverage on the steel and work it a bit more. And so basically all I'm going to be doing is starting at one end and working my way down the panel as I go, knocking down some of the high spots and pulling out some of the dents. Now, it's worth mentioning I am not a panel beater. I'm just a young bloke giving it a go myself with some few basic tools. Of course, I got Damo here to show me some tips and tricks along the way, but I'm going to be showing you that if I can do it, you can have a crack yourself. So we're going to be knocking out this dent here, probably giving this actually a bit more strength. What I want to do first, just to kind of help it, is to pull this out a bit. Now, I'm not reefing on it, I'm just being nice and gentle. When it comes to panel beating, you tend to become creative in your own way of bending, stretching, or mending your panels. Meaning, you may have to keep an eye out for a different tool in your arsenal to get the job done.
So when we're doing any body repairs or applying any body filler, it's really important that we can see any imperfections, any highs and lows, and also any pinholes. And one way we do that is by using guide coat. And U-Pole have developed this particular product, dry guide coat, which is a powder. And the great thing about the powder is it doesn't clog your abrasive, and also it gets down into all those little nooks and crannies so you can see every little imperfection.
Rust repair is done. The next stage is to apply our body filler. What we've done here is we've bolted the guard back up to the cab. The reason for that is this guard is quite old and a little bit flimsy, and if you do some of the panel prep and body filling off the car, you'll find that it may not fit just as nicely when you put it all back together. What happens is, for example, here there's a bit of a stress fracture just because the guard's old. If it's off the car and you body fill that section and you fill it up nicely and you put it back on the car, then when you go to bolt everything back up, it might crack the filler, particularly down here where we've done the repair. So you'll notice we have the door off. So we're going to be doing all our repairs with the door off. Then with the final fit up, we are going to put the door on and check that this line, this seam here in particular, is nice and it still fits everything beautifully. But for now, all I'm doing is I'm just going through and marking any imperfections, run your hand along, look down the side of it, see if you can see anything. And it just gives you a visual indication when it comes time to do the body filling stage. But from now, it's time to get into sanding, mix up our body filler, get it on the guard. As we were sanding, we also decided to throw on a bit of this special body filler that's got carbon fiber flakes in it to help add some strength to the vulnerable spots that we patched up earlier. Okay, it's time to mix up the rest of the body filler. Now, this is where some people probably get a bit carried away with adding hardener. So we're gonna show you how to add the right amount of hardener. We're gonna use scales. What this will show you is proportionally the right amount to add. Another important tip with your body filler is when you open the can, you can see there, it's nice and new. Don't mix it up. A lot of people will go, oh yeah, I've got to mix it up. But the problem is that'll aerate the body filler and that's how you get pinholes in your bog. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add our onion board to the scale. Then we're gonna tear the scale. So we need 40 grams of body filler. Now we've got our body filler on there, we've got 40 grams. So we're gonna add 2% of hardener, which, quick maths, is 0.8. So that's how much hardener you should add to around 40 grams of body filler. When you buy a can of body filler, you'll get a little packet of hardener, and this is enough hardener to activate the whole can. You might have heard some people say with the amount of hardener you need to add, it's around a pea to a golf ball size. That's pretty accurate, but we're gonna be using 2% hardener on the guard with our body filler. I reckon that's looking pretty good. Probably a good time to answer another question. This one was on YouTube from Mike Scudder, and he said, why are you doing all your panel beating once the epoxy primer is on there? Isn't it just gonna be beating on the epoxy primer? Well, the reason we do it that way is, first up, you wanna mechanically strip everything off like we did in the last episode to see what you're working with. When you're panel beating on a panel with epoxy primer, firstly you've got a good platform. The rust is treated, everything's ready to go, and these panels are also stored for a couple of months before we started all this work. So when you get them into primer after you've done all your rust treating, you can put them away and come back to it. In regard to panel beating, epoxy primer is pretty tough. It's not gonna crack and chip when you're doing your panel beating, but when it's at this stage, it's also easier to see any dents you do need to repair. Just on that as well, of course, we're also adding our bog over the epoxy primer. And again, the reason for that is so that we don't have any issues like we did with the roof. Remember, when Damien stripped off that old paint, there was body filler on raw steel, and under the body filler was rust. The reason for that is that body filler was applied to bare steel, and body filler uses heat to cure. When it was curing on that steel, obviously hot bog on a cold panel will create moisture. That moisture gets trapped under the bog, and before you know it, you've actually put rust on the panel the day you put the bog on. So by doing this, it avoids that process, and now we can sand it back and get it all nice before we go to our next step, spray polyester. But Mike Scudder, I hope that answered your question, mate. It's just a bit easier to work with when you're doing this long process. Now, while that's curing, I'm gonna go put some body filler on the other panels. I'll come back to this and sand it, and then move my way through. Hopefully that helps, mate. Just want to show you this. So what I'm doing right now is I'm welding up the old snorkel hole using a piece of steel I cut out and an acetylene torch. Now, if you're watching this at home and you're thinking, well, this is out of my league, I don't know how to oxy weld, don't let that put you off giving it a go, because I learned to oxy weld yesterday, and I'm still giving it a crack, and they're not going to be very pretty, but they're still going to be nice and strong. The other advantage of using an oxy torch is it still allows you to work the steel real nicely with a hammer and dolly, which means you can shape it. So what we've done here, I clamped it and tacked it, clamped it, tacked it, clamped it, tacked it, and moved around. And with each tack, we kind of zhuzhed the tack down a little bit with the hammer and dolly. As we tacked it, it's kind of shaped the steel into where it wanted to sit. And hey, I'm definitely not a panel beater, but I'm giving it a crack. And just the advantage of using an oxy compared to, say, a MIG welder is it just means you can shape the steel much nicer than you would with a MIG. And there you go, that's that piece all oxyed in. Now, as I mentioned, it's not the prettiest, but I reckon I'm pretty happy with that considering I learned how to do this yesterday. But yeah, don't be afraid to have a go yourself, particularly if you're a young fella and you're looking at what to do in life. Panel beating is a fair bit of fun. I'm actually really enjoying learning all these skills. That will do the job. Now we're mixing up the spray-on polyester body filler. Unlike the paste body filler that uses 2% hardener to the weight of the filler, the spray polyester uses 3% hardener to the weight of the reface filler. As always, we use a funnel filter to remove any remaining unmixed filler to avoid air bubbles in our spray. Then it's a case of cleaning your panel one more time with compressed air, then you're ready to start spraying. This next question comes from Darren Bogard, and he asked what we're doing with the insides of the guard. So, mate, what we are doing is we've given it just a light strip and then we've run a coat of Brunox over it. Now, this is an anti-corrosive epoxy primer as well, and we're actually just going to Raptor over the top of this once it cures. So that'll stop all the rust on the inside, and then the Raptor inside will also keep it nice from any stone chips or bits of crud that make their way up in there. An important thing to remember when spraying any primer and any paint is being consistent with the distance you're spraying at. This simple technique can make or break the final look. After letting the epoxy primer dry, I've thrown it back on the cab with some other panels to see how she's all looking. What do you reckon, mate?
That is unreal, I can't believe it.
I'm pretty stoked. That looks pretty good.
Yeah, well, those doors are going to come up really good. I was a bit worried about the great big holes we had in the middle there with the old mirror. So
You did a beautiful
pretty
job
happy with that.
on that. That looks nice.
Gonna be good.
Oh, unreal. How good is that? The Luxie is slowly but surely starting to come back together. Now, hopefully we showed you a couple of tricks and techniques that you'll be able to use on your project at home. Now remember, like we said at the start and a few times throughout the video, the process we showed you on that guard remains the same for the rest of the vehicle. So as you can see, the doors and the bonnet are still in spray poly, so we're gonna do all the extra work and get them in primer, and then the cab is pretty much ready for paint. Obviously the tub, we still got to do a fair bit of work on because whilst that was at sandblasting, we hooked into the body. So the body will be finished and then we'll hook into the tub. But that's all we got time for, and the next time you see this vehicle, we will be getting it ready for paint. I can't wait. By the way, your questions were fantastic. So if you've got any more that you want to know about the process, chuck them in the comments below, not just on YouTube. Throw some comments on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook as well. We'll be sure to answer them in the next episode. Oh, this car is going to be absolutely beautiful, and I cannot wait to see it all finished. Catch you next time.